Intellectuals are partial to making up new terms. I was surfing the net one day, and I found a term that I was not familiar with. Postmodern conservatism. This was at first strange to me, as highly reputed intellectual Dr. Jordan B. Peterson had informed me that postmodernism was invented by French neo-Marxists to destroy Western civilization.
We've been publicly funding extremely radical postmodern leftist thinkers who are hell-bent on demolishing the fundamental substructure of Western civilization.
I was confused, and I realized I would have to do some research if I were ever to escape this cognitive dissonance. I walked past this library on the way to a local indie coffee shop where I could use the Wi-Fi to watch YouTube. I was satisfied by this assertion such that I didn't need to do any more research. I maintain a pedestrian definition of postmodernism as a non-specific and cross-disciplinary rejection of the notion of universalizable normativity in nature, knowledge, history, or language. But I realized I would need a real intellectual if I were to ever figure out the meaning of this term. So, Matt McManus, you are an intellectual.
That's one word for it, sure.
But I'm the YouTuber, so I have all the power over the edit. And so, you've made up a new term?
I didn't exactly invent it. It was originally coined by Peter Augustine Lawler. It was
Postmodern conservatism. Great. See? Alpha. And how did you do that?
Well, I adapted the term and revised it to try to explain some of the developments that have taken place recently, particularly the rise of people like Donald Trump, Viktor Orban, and other reactionaries in the early 20th century.
He talked for a few minutes, long enough that I felt I knew enough on the topic to make a YouTube video on it. Then I went over to my friend's house to film. Postmodern conservatism. How can conservatives, the last stalwart defenders of Western culture, be postmodern when postmodernism is relativistic, nihilistic, and wants to erode the pillars of civil society?
Hell-bent on demolishing the fundamental substructure of Western civilization.
As if postmodernism is some leftist neurotoxin cooked up in the laboratories of the Sorbonne and University of Paris 8, intended to destroy the laughable amalgam they call Judeo-Christian values. Postmodern conservatism is the intellectual position.
Because it's somebody's version of the truth, not the truth. He didn't have a conversation
Truth is
about...
truth. I don't mean to go like...
No, it isn't truth. Truth isn't truth.
What do you even call this? You know what? Yo, why don't you just take this one? You know the format.
Postmodern conservatism is a kind of reactionary politics that emerged in the 21st century as a response to different socio-political, economic, and technological shifts. Especially, I would argue, the latter. To understand postmodernism in this way, we need to have a brief guided tour of 20th century critical theory.
Wait. This is an introductory channel. We're gonna need some definitions. So real quick, what is postmodernism in this context? Look here, I'll just throw it up on the screen.
Postmodernism is inherently a reaction to grand narratives that posit universal normative standards for what should be done in every local context.
And conservatism then, in this context?
Conservatism is a particular political philosophy going back quite some time, where our appeal to tradition suggests that social and political change should take place gradually, if at all.
Okay, so smashing this together, postmodern conservatism is something like an appeal to traditional normative standards, and it does so as a rejection of a grand narrative, which I suppose is a liberal open-mindedness to multiculturalism or something?
That's one of them.
So it takes the reactivity and rejection from postmodernism, couples it with traditional values, or what it calls that, and then tries to return to a nostalgic narrative of history so that we don't have to deal with any of the messiness of social change?
Yes, and they use the ambiguity of these kind of facts to foster a particular story that serves their identities that are rooted in nostalgia.
All right, carry on.
Where was I again?
We were going on a guided tour of French intellectuals.
Right. In the 1970s, the philosopher Jean-François Lyotard, the French thinker's French thinker, wrote a report with the snappy title, The Postmodern Condition. He argued that many of the grand narratives we use to make sense of the world from Christianity to Marxism, were losing their once dominant place in the popular imagination. And this created a lot of doubt in the place of the dogmas and skepticism in the place of certainty. While this was troubling for some like Christians and Marxists, it also created new spaces for others to create different kinds of identities, narratives, and styles that may have been stunted previously. All this was taking place in the context of the 70s and 80s. The church's influence was waning in public life, French intellectuals were reevaluating the authority of canonical political texts, and it seemed pretty clear that Soviet communism, and to a certain extent Marxism, was on its way out, both politically and culturally. In the 1990s, a young man called Francis Fukuyama theorized about the end of history, with the collapse of communist regimes taking place all around the world. First conservatives, this seemed to be a reason to celebrate. They had won the big one, the Cold War. But in fact, many savvier conservative philosophers came to recognize that the political right was on shifting ground intellectually, like everyone else was at the time. The grand narrative supporting it, from a Christian belief to the kind of dogma that the Western world was an indisputable force for good in the world, all of these became subject to new doubts. Conservatism, in fact, had in part stabilized itself by appealing to the threat of the now defunct evil empire that Ronald Reagan liked to talk about.
I would rather see my little girls die now, still believing in God, than have them grow up under communism and one day die no longer believing in God.
The consequences of this identity crisis were anticipated by a lot of critical theorists, most notably Fredric Jameson, the author of Postmodernism, or the cultural logic of late capitalism. Jameson argued that changing conditions had created a culture where unified identities increasingly were fractured, as the soil that had nurtured them increasingly lay fallow. Long-term changes were occurring that had been ignored in the face of the communist threat. And here are some examples. So rural areas have been depopulated by movements to big urban centers, younger generations were less tied by traditional religion, and virtually no one believed that the national governments they were electing were actually honest and trustworthy, particularly post-Watergate. The art of the time also expressed these ideas, either giving vent to nihilistic outrage a la grunge and cyberpunk, or responding reactively, bringing back cliched images and ideas about national identity. Think about the kind of action films of the time with the all-American men. These are all important parallels to postmodernism as a European intellectual movement, although their significance wasn't yet appreciated as much as it should be. See, for a long time, it seemed like these cultural phenomena had no real impact on day-to-day politics. For the most part, things settled into a comfortable neoliberal consensus that I grew and a lot of other people grew up in, from the fall of the Berlin Wall up until about the mid-2000s, while the economy chugged along. Inequality during this time period may have soared, job precarity increased, and we had to put up with an onslaught of shitty manufactured boy bands.
It's gonna be May.
But everyone agreed that things could be worse. Then in 2008, everything changed.
It was a manic Monday in the financial markets. The Dow tumbled more than 500 points.
There was the crash, recession, bailout, and suddenly millions of people were taking politics seriously again. Now, some on the right smelled an opportunity. One of these individuals was Steve Bannon, the eventual frontman of Breitbart News, and later an advisor to this man. Like the reality TV president, Bannon had a background in entertainment, producing some films and documentaries on right-wing politics. Bannon saw that the recession had made people angry, and instinctively understood that it brought to the forefront deeper anxieties about conservative and national identity, which had been bubbling beneath the neoliberal surface for quite a while. On the back of the Tea Party movement, Bannon helped set up Breitbart News, which quickly became famous for publishing a radical right-wing agenda, complete with disinformation, fear-mongering, and Milo Yiannopoulos, of course. These were signs of things to come. Breitbart and Bannon aligned themselves with Trump, both reactions to the broader cultural fragmentation diagnosed by Lyotard, Jameson, and many others. The narratives and traditions that many had relied upon to help frame their identities have been evolving in the face of socio-political, economic, and cultural shifts for quite some time. This development was complex and also helped emancipate a lot of the previously disadvantaged demographics, particularly women and minorities that have been restricted by the status quo, usually justifying this on traditionalist lines. However, all these developments also paved the way for the reaction that we call postmodern conservatism.
And just remember, what you're seeing and what you're reading is not what's happening.
Rather than dealing with the complex forces at work in the world, postmodern conservatism tend to blame all the developments that have taken place in the last 20 years on a group of enemies who are apparently responsible for everything from the cancellation of Firefly to the decline of the Western world. The kind of resentments and angers generated by these antagonistic politics culminated with the rise of figures like Trump, Farage, Orban, and others, all who promised to make their countries great again while eliminating the enemies of postmodern conservatives. Politically, they've been very successful, winning elections, often with a little assist from this guy, in Hungary, Poland, the United States, Italy, and Brazil, and winning the Brexit referendum in 2016. And they've also been gaining significant traction in countries like France and Germany. Mine and my colleagues' book discusses these developments in two different forms.
Whoa. You know, about half of the content on this channel is about how advertising is murdering reality.
I wasn't aware of that. And this isn't an advertisement besides. I'm making knowledge great again.
Well, why can't we just wrap it at that?
I'll buy you a beer if you want.
A beer sponsor?
Absolutely.
I have a beer sponsor. Damn, it's time to plug.
So our book is What is Postmodern Conservatism? Essays on our hugely tremendous time, mainly written by myself with some other contributors. It's going to be published by Zero Books later on this year.
And now that you've already explained it, why do people need to buy this book?
Well, it elaborates on all the points that we've made here, but it also goes into a lot more detail about three other factors. We look at a lot more about how technological change has engendered the rise of postmodern conservatism by creating all these kind of hyper-partisan new media, from Breitbart to other lesser-known websites. We also have a neat analysis of a lot of the different figures and writers who anticipated the emergence of postmodern conservatism, including a few on the right. And we have a really neat criticism of Jordan Peterson that I'm sure a lot of people will enjoy, given the popularity of the Lobster King.
Do you dare?
I do.
So that we can keep in touch, why don't I just throw the socials up? Let's say here, Zero Books, here. Unlike most intellectualese books, Zero Books are quite affordable. I know that, I have two, that's not a lie. All right, Worth, this is PlasticPills with intellectual Matt McManus. If this got you hot for the application of theory to the everyday, take a look at the other videos on my channel. Take a look at Zero Books if you are down with reinventing the left. I think I put them here. So yeah, you got any death threats yet?
Oh yeah.
Postmodern conservatism, now we know.
You're saying it's a falsehood, and they're giving alternative facts to that.